We are now preparing to be live streamed, and we are resuming recording. So we are also recording as well and have enabled the live transcript. So you are free to get started.
All right, fantastic. Welcome, everybody. We are now official. We were so eager that we had to do some work before we were even official, but we're now fully official. And as Christina said, we have folks who are attending on Zoom. So at this point, I see 27 attendees who are watching on Zoom, and then it's also available on the YouTube channel. So hopefully we have lots of folks who are engaging and will continue to share their thoughts with us throughout this process. But it is good to see you all, and a welcome to Walrick, who was not able to come to our first meeting. So it is good to see you. And we do have one or two folks who weren't able to come this evening. So we will continue to just catch people up. We're obviously doing this on short order and couldn't get perfect attendance at every meeting, but we're in pretty good shape. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. There we go. All right, can you all see that? We're good. And we do not, unfortunately, have the chat enabled tonight, so we will muddle along here without it. I did just send an email to all of you with a link to this this document, so that as we're going along, if it's helpful to go back and forth, you have it on your own computers, and then there are links to some other things within that. So hopefully that will sort of help us be able to stay on the same page. So we are going to do just a couple of sort of reminders of where we stand, and then we've got an action-packed agenda tonight. We're going to be spending some time digging into the definition of early childhood educators for purpose of this task force. So a question that was raised last time, just to make sure who are we talking about here. And then Sarah Mead is going to provide a foundational data overview for us, responding to a bunch of the questions that came up last time and in your intro surveys about just wanting to have the basic lay of the land. So we will spend some time doing that. As you all know, the much awaited compensation scale report from Aussie was released on Friday. A number of you had asked about that. And I know that folks may not have had a time to dig deep into that. We shared it with you, but obviously there's a lot in there. And Sarah, again, is going to just orient us to that document, and we're going to start to elevate some of the questions that come from it, but we're not going to get into all of the details, because we want everyone to get a chance to sort of really, read it and dig into it yourself before we spend a little more time on that, since it is so fresh. But we'll spend a little time on that. And then we're going to look at a draft table of contents for our final report. Obviously, there's not going to be any substance in there, any content, but just to see, here's what it is that we think we're supposed to be delivering based on what the task force charge was, and then based on a whole bunch of the issues that you all have raised to date, to make sure we touch on those things in some way. And then we'll give task force members time to share any big themes that have been coming up as you've been engaging with your various stakeholder groups. We know this is really early in the process and there's not a lot of content to respond to, but we do want to make sure even at this meeting, we're reserving some time for people to share back any big themes that are coming out of your conversation so that we can track them. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about how we're engaging additional outside experts beyond the task force, and then we'll close out. And we will take a little break in the middle, I promise, because I know this is a long time to be Zooming. Just a reminder of the expectations that we talked about last time, and tonight there are a few of these that we're really going to be leaning into, including building on work to date. So we're going to be looking at some stuff that that is already underway. So we're not starting totally from scratch, and again looking at the data. But just a reminder that the role of task force members, in addition to bringing your own individual expertise, knowledge, and experience to the table, that part of our roles is to be both communicating out to the various folks that we know who are interested in this work, what's happening in the task force, and to bring those thoughts back in. So again, we'll spend some time doing that, but just want to keep reminding ourselves that especially given the short timeline, it's just so important that we be going back and forth with various stakeholders so that we don't end up missing something important. Okay, this is the same timeline slide that you saw last time, but the red arrows, I guess, is that shape, show where we are. So we are in the midst of our task force meetings, and have those bi-weekly meetings scheduled. And are in the information gathering phase. And we'll look again at that table of contents in terms of just defining what those key elements are. I do just want to remind everybody that there's not a whole lot of time between that and the December 13th draft, where we're going to want to have at least the core model of what we're proposing. And that, so there's not a lot of time, and I want to just be just highlight that because there's going to need to be some work that we all do in between some of these meetings as well. All right, before I move into the definition stage, any questions or clarifications on any of that? Just initial review. All right, so let's get into it. So again, our name as a task force is the Early Childhood Educator Equitable Compensation Task Force. And at our last meeting, folks raised the question of who do we mean by early educators? Since at some point we're going to have to really be clear on where is this funding going? Whose pockets is is it going to end up in? And so I'm going to just walk through the next few slides. I'm going to warn you, it's a little wonky, but let me walk through it, and then we'll open it up to the group to ask questions and to provide some input. So the first thing I want to do is just start with super big picture before we get into the technical details. When we talk about early childhood educators, what do we mean vis-a-vis the broader field? So lots of you will recognize this graphic. It comes from NACCE's Power to the Profession. But the idea here is that the work of Power to the Profession really thought about what are the various roles in the early education field, their early childhood field, and where does early childhood educators per se sort of fall into that. So this is the basic definition that NACCE uses. Again, I know that certainly Kathy and Marika are very familiar with that. Many of the others of you are as well. But I wanted to just share this because I think this is sort of the spirit of what we're getting at before we get into the, if you will, the letter of the law. So early childhood educators providing direct service to children birth through age 8, responsible for meeting the guidelines of the profession. So what we're talking about here, sort of big picture, are folks who are providing direct service. But obviously we need to define that more specifically in terms of our scope. So here's what guidance we were given by both the legislation that created this task force, and then we'll look at the legislation that created the Pay Equity Fund. Okay, so these are some of the definitions that we were given to work with. So the first one's child development facility, meaning a center, home, or other structure that provides care and other services, supervision, and guidance for children, infants, and toddlers on a regular basis, regardless of its name. And child development facility does not include public or private elementary or secondary school engaged in legally required educational and related functions, or a pre-kindergarten education program licensed pursuant to the Pre-K Act of 2008. There are links to the the source of all this for folks who really want to get even deeper into the details. But I want to note that first piece there, the asterisk down below, that this language specifically excludes PKEEP, the pre-K enhancement program, expansion enhancement program. And we're going to get into that a little bit more later, but I wanted to highlight that, but because given the separate stream of funding that PKEEP has and the existing requirements in terms of pay parity, it is carved out in that definition of child development facility that it was in the task force language. So you can hold on to that for just a moment, but know that that is something that that's specific here. And Rakaya and Taryn, I see your hands. Hold off 1 sec. I'm just going to walk through this, but I definitely.
Sorry, it's not a question. I just got a message from one of my coalition members that the translators are having a hard time keeping up. So I was just going to ask you to slow down.
So sorry. Thank you for that input. Definitely not my strength speaking slowly, so I will try and do that. And please raise your hand again if I fail to do so. And yeah, especially this part, it's very language heavy here. So the second definition here, early childhood development provider, meaning a child development facility or CBO. So that language just being wrapped into what's above. And then the definition of a CBO, which again, I think is standard across what you all have seen. But those are the three definitions that were given as part of the task force. And then the Pay Equity Fund, which creates the pot of funding that we're talking about, the $70+ million annually, includes language to, quote, increase the minimum compensation of employees of early childhood development providers. It uses that same definition of early childhood development providers from the previous slide. But the word employee is not defined per se. Okay, so everybody with me? Now we're going to get into a proposed definition in just a moment. So in looking for a definition for employee, there is an existing definition in DC code of staff members in Aussie licensed child development facilities. So this is that definition. Staff members means child development facility center directors, CDC teachers, CDC assistant teachers, child development home caregivers, expanded child development home caregivers, and expanded child development home associate caregivers. And I want to note here that term child development facility center director that's named up here itself has a specific defined role in Aussie as part of Aussie licensing requirements as part of the facility staffing plan. So that's not just a sort of generic, that is a specific role. Again, all of this is in the slides that you all have in your email, because I know this is super dense. One more slide and then I'm gonna stop talking, I promise. So given all of the above, I feel like this is like an SAT problem. Given all of the above, drawing from those existing definitions, so again, we're not reinventing the wheel. These are things that have already been defined in DC code or regulations. Here is what we're proposing, that the universe of individuals eligible for this fund, so who it is that we're talking about, are those staff members in Aussie licensed child development facilities meeting this definition. So that employees term that's called out in our task force would mean child development facility center directors, teachers, and assistant teachers, and child development home caregivers, same thing, expanded child development homes, and associate caregivers, except staff members eligible for Pay Equity Fund shall not include staff members who provide pre-K services pursuant to the Pre-K Enhancement and Expansion Amendment Act. Okay. So I know that was a ridiculous amount. Let me stop there and get folks' reaction. Questions, clarifications. Does this seem right? Is it missing something? Is it too inclusive? Where are people's heads on this? So let me start with Taryn, who has been so patiently raising her hand.
Well, thank you. I think this slide clears up one of my questions. I mean, one was that if a facility provides any pre-K, would they not be counted in this, in this definition? And this clarifies it that because a facility might provide a pre-K classroom, but also have infant and toddler classrooms. So those infant and toddler teachers would be eligible for the equity fund, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And then my second question, so this definition of employees does not include employees that potentially have child serving roles, but are not teachers like coaches or enrollment specialists, or as well as janitorial staff or front office staff. Is that correct?
That is also correct.
Thank you.
Rakaya.
This time I have a question. So I just want to clarify the part at the end around pre-K. So it says pre-K does not include staff members who provide pre-K education services pursuant to PKEEP, the pre-K enhancement, whatever, you know what I'm trying to say. My question is, does that mean folks who are providing pre-K at all are who we're talking about, or are we talking specifically about pre-K staff who are whose facilities participating in PKEEP?
The latter. And so again, conceptually, the idea there is an existing funding stream that aligns with the Uniform Per Student Funding Formula for PKEEP that also has standards about pay. So the idea being essentially those pre-K teachers are already have this issue has been addressed through a different route. But if there are other pre-K teachers in programs that are not participating in PKEEP, then they would. Does that answer your question?
That's exactly the clarification I was looking for. Thanks.
Sarah.
Yeah, I'll just add one additional layer onto that it is also possible that there are facilities that have both PKEEP classrooms and non-PKEEP pre-K classrooms, for example, because they enroll children who live in Maryland or Virginia. And in that case, the teachers and assistant in the PKEEP classroom would be excluded, but the others would not by this definition, as I read it. Two other things about who I think this definition excludes that I just want to test my understanding, Abby, and also surface in case the group has feedback on them. This definition would exclude out of school time staff who are group leaders or assistant group leaders who may work in a child development facility, but are not included in the roles that are listed here. That's my understanding, and I'm going to test that. And then second, my understanding is that we are also saying this is limited to licensed child development facilities, but I want to also make sure that I'm understanding that correctly. I'm not assuming anything.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. So yes to both of those. And again, this is a proposal. So if people have thoughts about any of that, you should voice them. But yes, licensed facilities. So it would not include anything that's not an Aussie licensed facility. Again, totally separate from subsidy participation. This is just licensing, that category. And then yes, it would not include OST providers who right now are within Aussie's, within that sort of licensing and certainly subsidy pool, but it would not include them as currently proposed. Marika and then Sally.
Thank you for this proposed definition. Just a few questions. For PKEEP, in some ways, by excluding them, we've inadvertently or implicitly established that the salary for PKEEP is the threshold or the ideal. That's one I just want to point out. And with PKEEP, does that include, like, how is compensation being defined here? Is it salary or salary and benefits?
So say that second question again in terms of how it connects with PQ.
So we haven't defined what compensation means yet, but we've already established that keep lead educators and parapros, for lack of a better word, have already met that or do not need additional support to meet whatever the ideal compensation will determine is.
So I think that is a fair question, and I actually I think it's less, and tell me if I'm understanding this right, Marika, it's less about this definition than about the implications of the definition. Is that right? Like that essentially you would, that this definition might, with respect to PKEEP, might be proposing a particular standard for compensation or salary, like assuming that PKEEP is the standard in the language that you use.
Yeah, it's assumed that, yes, PKEEP salary is the standard or higher than the standard. And the fact that we haven't talked about benefits and yet in the sort of compensation, pay parity conversations a little bit. Just want to point that out. We don't have to hash it out right now.
Yeah. No, I think it is. So my interpretation of that, Marika, is that I don't know that that one way or another it would necessarily change how we defined this group. But I think down the line, when we're talking about what the implementation implications are for whatever directions we go, that looking at where the PKEEP educators are is going to be, we're going to have to circle back and look at that, because practically speaking, it will be a real comparison that's going to be on people's minds. And so I think we are far from answering that question, but my sense is that it's not critical. It's not a critical path question to answer in terms of in terms of creating this definition. It's a critical path question to answer in terms of what that salary scale looks like and how we define compensation, whether it's salary or more broadly.
But it excludes them. The definition excludes them.
Right.
Okay. So, and then one other, sorry, just for clarity around the use of center director specifically and not administrator. So that does not include assistant director or coaches.
That's right. And Sarah, can you tell us a little bit more about the center director role per se, like what that includes and therefore doesn't include?
So the center director role does have specific responsibilities that are outlined in the licensing requirements, including supervisory responsibilities. And there's also a requirement that there always be somebody who is identified either as the director or as an assistant director or a backup director present at the facility. So it is a specific role. It isn't just like any person, and there are specific qualifications requirements in the licensing regulations as well. Sally actually is one, I think, and can probably speak to it more coherently than I can right now.
Thank you, Sarah. Sally and then Walrick.
Hi, my question has to do, since you mentioned families that come from Maryland and Virginia and use the programs. Would this definition apply to educators in the child development facilities, regardless of their state of residence? So somebody who works in Maryland who comes into DC to work, they would still be considered eligible and would fall under this definition?
That is my understanding, and unless people think that this language somehow would exclude, but that was my understanding of the intent.
Okay, thank you.
And to be clear, I mean, I'm just when in answering these questions, I'm just clarifying what I think this language says. I don't get to decide, right? So this is everyone can push back on the substance of it in addition to the clarifying, just to be clear. All right, Walrick and then Marla.
Sure. So I think in response to, I was thinking about what Marika had mentioned. and I just want to make sure that my read of it is correct, is that by the exclusion of PKEEP is less about the basis as to whether or not the compensation level is, let's say, adequate, right? Or give some indication of adequacy, and more so, I understood it as like the exclusion was just based on the funding source itself or the funding pool. Is that the right way to be thinking about this? Like, right, the exclusion was the reason why they were excluded is because the funding pool that provides for their compensation is separate and apart from the one that we're talking about here. Is that correct?
So, and this is something that we could go back, Christina Setlow, to council members about, and we're having some conversations with them generally to make sure we're understanding intent. But I think that it is both of those things, Warwick, that the separate funding source, but also because with that funding source comes an expectation of the compensation expectation. And we can circle back with the details on what that standard looks like. To Marika's point, I think we're going to want to look at it specifically down the line, but I think it's both, and that's why the council carved that out.
Okay, understood. Thank you.
Marla.
I have two clarifying questions. One to Marika's point again, and I think we're getting clear and clear with Warwick's comments. But is it possible that you could meet the pre-keep pay requirements and still not meet the requirements under this particular legislation, because we're not sure that pre-keep is just salary or salary and benefits? So I think we just need to pay close attention to that, because it could create a situation where you meet the compliance on pre-keep, but you're not paid at the level of an infant and toddler teacher. And that would create some discontent in the system. So I just want to make sure we're keeping an eye on that.
I appreciate that, Marla. And what this is sounding to me like is that this needs to be added to the list, that the running list that you'll see in the table of contents, but of the sort of unintended consequences or like risk mitigation. Like we're gonna have to circle back to that, because I think what you described, that scenario would be problematic, and it is knowable to some degree once we get further down the line. So so I appreciate people elevating this.
Okay, and that was the one comment, because yeah, we want to make sure that doesn't present itself. And then I had a second comment, but now I think I've lost track of it. So I'll come back to it when I do. So I'm sorry.
No problem. Let us know if you think of it. Okay, so let me summarize what I think I'm hearing at this point, which is—
Abigail, I remembered, I'm sorry. So Sarah also mentioned that the center director is a role, not a person. And so you must have a person who is serving in the capacity of center director on site at all times. But that person might be the assistant director, and it might be an instructional coach, and all of them have the credentials. So this term of just center director, I think also is kind of unclear, because does that mean that those people are also to be paid at this scale or not?
I'm on mute. So my understanding is that it means that they would be reflected somewhere in the scale. Exactly where they'd be would be connected to the way the scale gets laid out in terms of credentialing and, you know, the various roles, which obviously is yet to be determined. So yeah, so I think—
Because they're not included in a definition by title. That's why I'm just trying to be clear.
Right. I mean, I guess the question is, if it is a unique role, I mean, I think so. So I think the idea is that if you exclude that role, then it's in some ways similar to the scenario you described in terms of P-keep. Like, do you end up in a situation where those individuals are left, are sort of left behind, as it were, which would create additional challenges within the center. But I think it sounds like it's probably going to be helpful for us to dig into what that definition is and what the implications are in real life of including that role. And Sarah, maybe that's something that down the line you can help us dig into.
Yeah, and I think this is an area where it would also be helpful to get perspectives from the practitioners who are in the group on how it looks in your programs, and we can also, look at other programs as well.
Yeah.
So this is Christina Encinas. I think that we do have a pre-keep program with, in the private and the 0 to 3. I think everything it's going to have to come down on how the funds are distributed, because the salaries of the pre-key right now are very much more higher than the 0 to 3. I mean, no comparison. But it's a reimbursement program for the organization. So the organization has the center has the freedom to select what type of benefits we'll provide to the staff. It depends on how big of your staff, how big your center is. The smaller, the more difficulties you have to actually provide all the benefits. So it is going to be a little cumbersome to see how it impacts. But right now, I mean, the pre-keep teachers, their salaries are even higher than what we've seen. Obviously, the requirements for their bachelor's, and some of the parity for the level of education that they need are not the same. So this, I think, it's going to be, at the end, what I'm thinking is, how is the money distributed to the agencies, and is it reimbursed, or is that is going to be the challenge.
For sure. I think that is where we're going to end up spending the better part of our time together over the course of the next, however long we have. I want to just make sure that in terms of this initial definition, if there are any other comments specific to that, that we get those out on the table, and make sure we've documented all of it before we move on. So Sally, and then Cynthia.
I think Kathy was waiting ahead of me.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you, Sally. So I have a question around administrators or center directors. So is it my understanding, and please clarify it, that the center directors and instructional coaches would fit in somewhere along the salary scale?
So this definition calls out, again, the center director, that specific role that's defined in Aussie licensing. Okay. So that person has a different title, to Marla's point, may have a different title in different facilities. It does not include coaches, this particular definition.
But it could include coaches.
If this group decides that it should include coaches, okay. And if that role is a defined, is a defined role, then yes. I mean, again, part of what we're trying to determine here is what should this include, and there is, there are obviously big implications to who's included and who's not included in terms of how far the money goes and what we prioritize. But yes, I think that's a question for the group.
And in terms of, thank you. And in terms of center director and pay parity, in DCPS, their instructional leaders are classified as principals, and center directors would be comparable to a principal. So is there not an idea of a separate pay scale as in DCPS? Because there's a separate pay scale specifically for principals and assistant principals.
So I would say two things. One, I don't know that that's the right analogy. So it might be in certain situations, but I don't want to assume that that's the right analogy to a school building principal, given the different structures. That said, for the pay scale that we end up recommending, what we've been asked to do is to look at a pay scale that is defined by role, by credential, and what's the third thing, people? By experience. And so that's where we would be in the position of being able to define, what is this role, and where does it fall along along the different levels of the pay scale, including what credentials are required or involved.
And let me just clarify, when I say comparison to principals and directors, I'm not trying to say that the responsibilities are exactly the same, but I'm speaking in terms of different responsibilities than educators.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, Sally, and then Marla, is that a new hand or an old hand?
I will lower it. I'm sorry.
Okay, no problem. So Sally, and then Walrick.
And then it was Cynthia.
Does it make sense, since we started off this conversation looking at NACCE's power to the profession, and if you actually look at their definitions of early childhood educators, they don't say a specific, assistant teacher, lead teacher, because they look at role in the center or role in a program. They look at qualifications. They don't take in years of experience, but they cover two of those factors. And that, if we looked at it, maybe look at that to get some guidance on how to define roles and programs, it would maybe alleviate some of these questions about instructional coaches, because it really does emphasize that if they have an instructional or an educational role in a program, and then based upon their degree, then it determines what they are, and they have 3 levels. And so that just may be something that everybody would look at, just to get, it might change our thinking rather than getting hung up specifically on these, the words, the semantics here, and thinking about, we're looking at salary based on credentials and experience, but not necessarily, I'm a center director, somebody else might be called a head of school. Where does that fall under the pay scale? But if it's because I have a master's with X amount of years of experience, I would get this amount of pay.
I appreciate that reference, and I think it would be helpful for us to look back. I want to just once again, sort of focus us on the idea here is, because we are doing something that's going to be administered across lots of different places. Again, whatever mechanism we use, that we, in some way, shape, or form, we need to define the universe of eligibility. And so the idea here is these are terms that exist in our practice, in our DC code, in our regulation, in existing functions that Aussie and others have. Now, whether they are all of the right roles, I think, is a fair question. But I want to make sure that we're, at the end of the day, we're going to need to have a specific definition that is beyond, sort of like what are people's sort of general responsibilities. With respect to the point around credential, part of what we are asked to look for in the pay scale, or to factor into the pay scale, is degree attainment and credential. So I think that piece of it would be part of that analysis. And again, we'll look at this first first round of the pay scale that Aussie developed, which has that as part of it. So we'll be able to see how that plays out. All right, so I've got Cynthia and Walrick, and then I am going to move us along because I want to make sure that we get into the data. I'll try and summarize where I think we are before we do that. But let's hear from Cynthia and then Walrick.
Hello, everybody. One thing I wanted to make sure that I understood, because I see here one thing that was in Aussie's pay scale is that they don't consider us as the director in our programs. I see the expanded child development home caregiver and the expanded child home associate caregivers. That's for both homes, 6 children and expanded out. But the point that I wanted to make that if we're talking about inclusion, the center director is also in the child development home with those credentials and degrees. So I'm hoping that we as a unit, when we're thinking about that equity piece, consider that and to make sure it's covered across the board.
Yeah. Thank you, Cynthia. So I think that the question of how child development homes fit into the different roles is a fair one. And certainly when we talk about our commitment to making sure we're advocating for educators across our diverse delivery model, that obviously is a prime example. So I do think that one of the things that clearly coming out of the conversation that we need to get clearer on is the center director role. The question you asked, Cynthia, is another element of that. So how do we think about the different roles within a child development home that have different terms? Which of those terms are the sort of comparable ones? Including how we think about center director role. And again, there's existing practice that we can look at in terms of how Aussie already sees those roles. But I hear you in wanting to make sure that we're pressure testing that existing practice with an equity lens. So I think that's, again, like that seems clearly one of the next steps from this definition conversation is getting into that particular role. Walrick.
I'll make it quick, I promise. On the set of next steps is the clarity around like the coaching role. I just don't understand the basis for the exclusion of that role in particular, but happy to look at whatever information there is outside of this group. I just want to make sure that I understand to what degree is that coaching role actually engaged in caring for the child and so on, or maybe not, and that's why that specific role has been excluded, but not necessarily something we need to debate or take up now. But if it could be on the follow-up list, that'd be great.
Yeah. And this is also making me think that one of the things that we had talked about at our first meeting was the possibility of having some committee work happen between meetings on specific issues. It feels to me like there's some specific questions that we need to flesh out and clarify. And again, part of what we want to do is hand back in our recommendations to council something that is implementable. So we don't want to hand them something that's like, it's for people who like kids, we want to be as specific as we can so that this money gets where we want it to go as effectively and efficiently as it can. And these questions you all are raising are legitimate ones that have implications in terms of, again, the number of people and therefore how far that pot of money goes, but also what it is that we're prioritizing, where the existing gaps are, all of that. So what I'm hearing is there are two sort of, or I'd say three kind of big substantive questions that we need to sort of chase down in terms of settling on this definition. But one is around PKEEP. Part of it is simply being clear about the fact that right now, as Christina and Sina has shared, the PKEEP teachers do in fact have a much higher salary than the 0 to 3 in even in the same facilities, and we need to make sure we think about what the implications are if those folks are excluded for all of the reasons that feel reasonable to exclude them from this particular pot of money. What are the ways that we're going to circle back and make sure that we're not recreating inequities in some way as a result of that exclusion. So that's one that I want to make sure that we figure out a way to pursue. The second is around, are there other roles, and the coach role has come up a couple of times, but are there other roles beyond the ones named here that feel like they actually meet the spirit of the definition? And therefore, do we want to explicitly add them? And then the specific role of center director, getting more clarity, one, on exactly what that is in practice, and therefore where it should fall. And does it exist as a separate role that should be in its own, line on a pay scale, or is it more complicated than that? So one of the things I'd like to do as follow up to this meeting is to identify folks who feel like they are both particularly interested in and or feel like they have particular sort of thoughts or experience around this question that we could pull aside a little committee to try and chase down some of those questions. Does that sound fair? And I see Cynthia. I don't know if that was your old hand up, Cynthia, or a new one. And Christina, is this something that you want that needs to be a part of this definition conversation, or?
Sorry, I just lowered my hand.
Okay, cool.
Just very quickly, I just wonder if we have data on salaries of centers director. I'm just saying because that will be helpful for us to know if there is a gap or not.
Yep, that you're right. And as you will see, as Sarah starts to share in the data piece, unfortunately, the answer to that question is no in any comprehensive way. But that doesn't mean that there aren't ways we could try and find some proxies. So I think that's a fair question. Okay, I totally forgot about talking slowly. Apologies. All right, so let's are people good with that summary of next steps? Like, does that feel like the right? I'm seeing some nods. Okay. All right. So the next thing we're going to do here is actually, maybe we should take a 5-minute break before we do this. Because otherwise we're going to be sitting here a long time. Let's do that. Let's take a I have 6:54. Let us reconvene at 7. So we're gonna get 6 whole minutes to stretch, do what you need to do, and then we'll get back into it. All right, folks, refreshed and ready to get back at it. So we are now going to dig into, again, some of the foundational data. And let me just give a little bit of context before I hand the mic over to Sarah. So, oh, thanks, Christina. Our last conversation was getting at the sort of definitional universe of educators that this effort is targeting. And again, we've got some open questions on that. What we're going to do now is to look at some of the data of what might that population look like. Again, given there's still outstanding questions on exactly what those parameters are, but in any case, what are some of the categories that are relevant to our work? And so part of that is around just the question, as we talked about, the total numbers of individuals, because we've got a pot of money, and it's, it obviously is more or less for any given individual, the more or less or fewer folks there are. But the other thing that I want you all to keep in your heads as Sarah talks about this data is what the implications are of the mechanisms for getting the funds to educators. And Christina Encinas has talked about that a little bit ago, but some of the data that we're looking at has implications in terms of that. There's lots of good data in this presentation. We could go down 100 rabbit holes if we wanted to, and many of us are sort of data nerds who would love to just ask questions because they're interesting. And I'm just going to ask everybody to really try and think about what are the things that we think are most likely to have an impact on our work and are just the decisions we have to make as Sarah does this. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Sarah, and you can direct me when to move slides. If you want to just give us a couple of opportunities to ask questions, but I do want us to get through all of it. So keep that in mind as we go. Sarah.
Thanks, Abby. And I will try to be relatively brief while also speaking at a pace that can be translated. I'm going to start out, if we want to move on to the next slide, just with some contextual data on the early childhood landscape in the district. There are over 470 licensed child development facilities that serve children birth to 5 in the district. This number is a little bit lower than numbers you may have seen publicly reported on our website, because we did, for purposes of this analysis, exclude a set of facilities that remain temporarily closed as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. Over 90% of facilities have reopened, but there are some that have not yet reopened. And there's a subset of those who currently have inactive licenses. So we took them out of the analysis. That's why this number is about 471 right now. That is broken down between child development centers, of which there are about 356, and homes, of which there are 105. And then if you look at the stacked bars, the red portion of the stacked bar is the child care subsidy programs, and the gray portion of the stacked bar is the programs that do not accept child development subsidies. And as you can see, a little more than half of the total facilities are participating in the subsidy program. The percentage of centers that accept subsidies is higher than the percentage of homes that accept subsidies. If we want to move on, I can talk a little bit about where Aussie keeps data on child development facility staff, as well as what that data does and doesn't include. So there are 2 main systems that Aussie has that collect and maintain data on the early childhood workforce. One of those is the Division of Early Learning Licensing Tool. This is the data system where all of our licensing data for child development facilities lives. That is a system that is oriented specifically around facilities. And so all the information is organized relative to facilities It does include information on all staff that are subject to criminal background check requirements, which is a broader universe of individuals than the definition we just spoke about. And those records include the names of staff, their roles. It connects to the facility and all the information on the facility. And then it includes information on staff qualifications. Separately, the professional development information system is the district's workforce registry system where early childhood educators can track professional development and educational credentials. A broader range of individuals that are included in DELT have PDIS accounts, including pre-K teachers in charter and DCPS schools, coaches, some of our partners in other agencies such as the Department of Behavioral Health, mental health consultants. So there are more people in the PDIS system, and that system does include a finer grain of data on those participants' education if they choose to upload it. Most of the data that I will share with you today does come from the DELT system, our licensing system, because that information is more universal than the information in the PDIS, much of which individuals can choose how much information they want to input into that system. And it also, the information that's in the DELT system can be more clearly aggregated and cut and maps more clearly to the focus of this task force's work. If we move on to the next slide, I'm going to touch just a little bit about what this information does and doesn't include. Using the data in these two systems, Aussie is able to provide information on the number of staff in licensed facilities, their roles, their qualifications, and analyses of the numbers of staff by facility type and participation in subsidy. Aussie does not currently have data on staff experience in a consistent way or staff compensation and benefits. In the past, Aussie did collect information from providers participating in the subsidy system on their staff salaries in order to assess compliance with the District's Living Wage Act requirements. However, we stopped doing that a few years ago in an effort to streamline the burden on child development providers of participating in subsidy and the amount of documentation we were collecting. And also because now the district's minimum wage is equal to the living wage. So child development facilities are separately under just basic minimum wage requirements accountable to pay the living wage, which was not the case in the past. And even if we look back at the older years when we were collecting that information, it was not provided in a format that could be pooled, aggregated, and synthesized in a way that reflects the questions that are relevant to this task force's work. So if we want to move on to the next slide, I want to pause and go through who is and isn't included in the data we're going to talk about just now, relating to the conversation that we just had. And so, Aussie's licensing system includes several types of staff, and the information that is associated with those staff in Aussie's data system is based on the roles defined in Aussie's childcare licensing regulations, because all the information we collect in our licensing system is tied to things that are required or defined in our licensing regulations. And so if you look at the red box, I have drawn that around a set of roles that we believe are relevant to the scope of this work. Child Development Center directors, as we discussed, teachers and assistant teachers in centers, child development home caregivers, expanded child development home caregivers, associate home caregivers, and home or expanded home assistants or substitutes. We have excluded from the data presented here all of the out of school time roles because we don't understand them to be part of the charge, as well as a set of other positions that may be included in our licensing database, such as aides, volunteers, substitutes, other individuals who live in child development, homes who are required to be criminal background checked. There are some individuals in the system who do have identification as coaches or instructional leaders, as we were discussing. However, because that's not a position defined in our licensing regulations, that information is not consistent in a way that can clearly be aggregated and analyzed in the way these specific roles do. I just want to note, I know that we've received feedback in the past about some of the titles for home caregivers not reflecting the respect that we accord to the profession. I completely understand that. We're going to use these terms in presenting data today because it's what it's in our licensing regulations, and just for clarity about that definition. But please don't interpret that as discounting the fact that home child care educators are educators. So I'll move on now to the next slide to talk a little bit about the method that we used to provide this data to you. So Aussie analyzed current childcare staff data that we downloaded from our licensing system as of October 5th. That information, we took the file of staff that was pooled, integrated information on the facility's licensing status, active or inactive, subsidized childcare participation of the facility, as well as participation in 3 other programs: the Quality Improvement Network, Pre-K Enhancement and Expansion Program, and Shared Services Business Alliance. We eliminated any staff who had a separation date in the system. That means those are staff who had left an employer, but their records were still in the system, as well as inactive licenses. And we took out, for the purposes of this analysis, all staff who were in non-educator roles, such as janitors, cooks, other individuals living in child development homes, as well as out-of-school program staff. So if we can move on to the next slide, I want to talk about a few caveats. Again, licensing regulations and supporting systems are focused on facilities, not individuals. So the data that was collected through those systems is focused primarily on assessing whether the facilities are complying with licensing requirements for their staff. It's not designed primarily as a system to track real-time data on facilities. These data are on staff. These data are representing one snapshot in time. We don't have a direct interface with childcare provider data systems and our licensing systems, so the data does have to be sort of handed off to us and then updated in our system. That means it's not updated on an ongoing basis in real time as soon as changes happen in facilities. And often records are added or updated either when a facility requests a suitability determination for a new staff member, or in the context of licensing inspections. And so it just doesn't perfectly track the exact reality at that moment in time. However, because the focus of this work is on aggregate looks at questions about the workforce rather than individual staff or program level questions, we can be reasonably confident that this data does provide a directionally accurate picture of the current state. And there's a number of work that we have done over the past few months in preparation for knowing this task force was coming to really review the quality and accuracy of the data in our licensing system on staff. I do also just want to note that this is current time data. So to the extent that child development facilities may be operating at reduced capacity or staffing due to the impacts of the pandemic or workforce shortages, these data may not fully reflect the typical workforce over time. And we can talk a little bit more about the potential implications of that for the work. But I think it probably makes the most sense to dive into the data. So I'll go on now to the next slide, where you can see data looking at child development facility staff by role. So the center bar reflects all staff. You can see that over 90% of staff work in child development facilities. There are a total of just under 3,500 staff after we pooled the data from our system and excluded the groups I talked about a minute ago. And then if we break that down further, if you look at the bar that is on your left, that breaks out the roles of Child Development Center staff. Directors are the dark bar at the bottom, then teachers and assistant teachers. And you can see that there are more teachers than assistant teachers, but that those numbers are, in the same ballpark. Then on the right-hand side bar, I have broken out the roles for child development homes. So you can see home caregivers, expanded home caregivers, associate caregivers who work in expanded child development homes, and then assistants or substitutes. All child development homes are required to identify someone who can serve as a substitute or backup if the home provider is unavailable, and so that's what that role reflects. If you move on to the next slide, then we can look at how that breaks down by subsidy participation. So this takes the same data that you saw on the previous slide about total numbers of staff in facilities broken out between homes on the right, centers on the left, and all facilities in the center. But this breaks it out between subsidy and non-subsidy, with subsidy in the red bars on the bottom and non-subsidy in the blue bars on the top. And you can see that for the system overall and for child development centers, a little bit over half of the staff are working in facilities that participate in subsidy. But when we look at homes, that number is lower. About 40% of staff are working in homes that participate in the subsidy program. Now I want to move on to talk a little bit about credentials. And we can share some data that is a little bit more fine-grained and broken down with you on credentials, but for purposes of looking at this all together as a group, we pooled together all of the staff roles across all the settings and just presented it broken down by the common credential types. That's a little bit more accessible than looking at the very detailed breakdown. So what you can see in looking at this is that there are about 20% of folks who work in facilities. Wait, no, higher than that. It's closer to a little less than a third of folks who work in facilities across both types of facilities, homes and centers, have an associate's degree or higher. That light pink bar and the sort of gray bar right above it are associate's degrees, and bachelor's degree or higher, respectively. The biggest percentage of staff in child development facilities have a CDA, with a little over 1,000 people in that category. And then thank you, who's ever making the pointer for me. And then there are about 800 folks who have less than a CDA in the system currently, with either a high school diploma or GED, or enrolled in a CDA program but not yet completed. There is a set of folks that are labeled other here. That includes people who have some less common credentials, like Montessori credentials or other professional certificates. But it also includes folks who have no credential information reported in our system. So I wouldn't assume that all those folks have lower credentials than the other credentials reported here, but that may be the case in some of these circumstances. So now I want to move on. I'll pause now and see if folks have any questions about that overall data, and then I thought it might be helpful to share a little bit of information about a few specific programs that may inform the task force's thinking. Does anybody have questions for Kaya?
Just one quick one. I'm just wondering about the inclusion of 48 plus credit hours. Do you guys use that for a particular reason?
It is a qualification in our system. It's one of the things that's defined in our licensing requirements as meeting the requirements for specific roles. Taryn?
Thank you. This is really interesting. Do you have a crosswalk between position and educational credential? These are all staff, correct?
Yes, and we provided an Excel file that we'll share with you offline that does give that breakdown. We can't give that breakdown for the different home roles. We have to aggregate it for all homes because the numbers are too small to share without disclosing individually identifiable data. But we can share that broken down across the center-based roles and for all home providers in the aggregate.
Great, thank you.
Yep. Marika.
Thank you for sharing this. For the credential or the licensing staff, just indicating the type of credential in the system, or they're collecting the actual artifact and including it in the database system?
I'm not going to be able to answer that question in real time, but I can follow up and tell you this is pulled from the data that's in our system. Obviously, all the data that's in our system on things like staff credentials or suitability, other things related to staff, there are specific requirements for staff record keeping. And so those are things that do get reviewed during licensing inspections. But in order for us to pool or analyze anything, it has to be entered as a data field, separate from the actual artifacts.
My other question is, it doesn't speak on the slides, and maybe it's somewhere else. It doesn't speak much about the credential type. Is there some other place we can look to actually see the credential type? So it has an associate's degree, but doesn't say in child development, early childhood, elementary.
This is an associate's degree in any field, or a bachelor's degree or higher in any field are what's presented here. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep. And Marika, we do have more fine-grained information on credentials in the PDIS system. Yep. Okay. All right, I do want to talk briefly about 3 additional programs that may be relevant to the task force's work: the Shared Services Business Alliance, Quality Improvement Network, and the Pre-K Enhancement and Expansion Program, which may help get at some of the questions folks were asking earlier. We can move on to the next slide. So the Shared Service Business Alliance provides business and administrative supports for homes and small child development centers. Currently, there are 66 facilities participating. Because these are small facilities, they have a total of 173 staff. But the Shared Service Business Alliance is helpful to understand for this work because it does provide shared back office services to participating providers that both helps the providers encounter business efficiencies and increases their revenue, which may help them to increase the compensation of their staff. Our cost modeling work does show that participating in the Shared Service Business Alliance significantly improves the bottom line of participating facilities. And it's also included here because the shared administrative and back office support function doesn't currently include payroll or benefits, but could potentially provide a vehicle for delivering enhanced compensation or benefits to smaller facilities that may have greater challenges in implementing either of those, as Maria Cristina and Sinas mentioned earlier. Originally, the Small Service Business Alliance was limited to homes and limited in the number it could serve. With our COVID relief funds, we are expanding the program to make it available to all child development homes and level 1 childcare subsidy providers. So there is also potential to expand this to include more facilities, and we are seeing an increasing number of facilities take advantage of that opportunity and sign up. Second, I'll talk about the Quality Improvement Network. This is our early Head Start childcare partnership model, where we work through hub agencies to support networks of child development facilities, both centers and homes in separate networks, in meeting the early Head Start performance standards and support the delivery of comprehensive services to children and families who qualify and are enrolled in those programs. There are 32 facilities between the center and the home Quinn participating with 235 staff. All Quinn facilities participate in childcare subsidy because it's tied to our subsidy program. Why is this relevant for compensation? Again, the analysis that we've done shows that the increased revenue and supports from Quinn participation do enhance participating providers' revenue and their ability to pay their staff. And teachers in the Quinn receive stipends. They don't go anywhere near what we think parity would look like, but there is a compensation element for teachers in the center-based portion of the Quinn that may be relevant for this work. And just, I know there are some other quality improvement networks that Bainham supports and that Educare supports. This is just focused on the Aussie supported Quinn. And then finally, I do want to talk about the PKEEP program. As we mentioned previously, this is the portion of our publicly funded pre-K program that is delivered in community-based organizations and child development facilities. There are 28 providers with about 33 facilities participating currently. Just under 1,000 children were served in the program last year. We're still validating the enrollment for this year. Those facilities collectively have 488 staff, but that includes, as we discussed previously, staff who are not PKEEP specific staff. There are about 60 PKEEP teachers and 60 assistant teachers based on enrollment. Again, we don't have the current data yet for this year because we are still in the process of synthesizing that. So why is this relevant? First, the PKEEP high quality standards do require participating programs to pay PKEEP teachers and assistant teachers at parity with the DCPS salary schedule. We also think that there may be lessons from this program, either positive or negative, that can help inform as we think about what it would look like to increase compensation for more childcare workers. Programs that participate in PKEEP are required to pay this parity compensation, and then they receive funding. In the case of subsidy children, the funding comes on top of the subsidy payment to cover the difference between the pre-K subsidy reimbursement rate and the uniform per student funding formula that is paid to charter schools and DCPS. In the case of children who don't qualify for subsidy, PKEEP covers the entire uniform per student funding formula amount. PKEEP is currently operated as a grant program. Child development facilities need to complete a grant application every year. They need to provide substantial grant-related paperwork through Aussie's grant program, and then they file monthly reports on program activities and expenses and are reimbursed on a monthly basis for those expenses. And all the payments they receive, while they're based on the uniform per student funding formula, the actual disbursement of funds to providers is based on those monthly reports. I'm sharing this just because this is a model that currently exists to supplement other funding sources to support parity compensation for a small subset of the child development facility sector. And it may be informative for this task force as you think about your work. I think those were all the slides I had on data. I'm ready to pause and answer any additional questions that folks may have. And I will note that while participating in PKEEP significantly enhances the finances of child development facilities that participate, because that USPF amount is more than the pre-K subsidy reimbursement rate. The infant and toddler subsidy rates under our FY22 subsidy payment is higher than the USPFF amount because we know it costs significantly more to serve infants and toddlers. Ms. Davis?
Oh, hello. I just wanted to know if facilities decide that they don't want to participate in the shared services or any of the Quinn and things like that, will they be penalized and not be able to still get the benefit if they choose not to participate in the
So the shared service business alliances in the Quinn have specific benefits that are tied to participation in the program. We're sharing that information just for informational purposes with the group. We're not proposing that the compensation benefit be limited to facilities that participate in those initiatives. I'm sharing them more because they are potential tools that could be informative for thinking about how we could implement other programs.
Thanks. I just want, thank you.
Mhm.
Any other questions for Sarah at this point? Again, you all have this deck linked in the other deck, and it's also in the meeting materials folder, so you can go back and look at it. But if there are any other questions for Sarah at this point, just to clarify what you saw, want to give people a chance to ask. Okay, so I'm gonna, in just a moment, give it back to Sarah, give her a chance to breathe for just a second. But wanna just underline the last thing that Sarah said in conversation with Cynthia around those three particular programs could be instructive to us as we continue to run down what are the best mechanisms for delivering this funding. And those are certainly not, we're not remotely limited to those options, but they provide some models for that exist that we can look at how they currently play out. What are some of the pros and cons? Do we want to leverage any of those programs or any of those approaches to delivering funding? And could that sort of inform us? So want to be clear that we're not in any way tied to an existing mechanism, but it's helpful to see what some of the existing mechanisms, how they operate, and again, what some of the pros and cons are as we figure out what makes most sense for this particular pot of money. So we are now going to shift. Oh, sorry, Rakaya.
Thanks, Sarah, for this really informative presentation. And Abby, to kind of what you were just speaking about, when will be the right moment for us to dig into those mechanisms that Sarah just presented and talk through kind of what we can learn from them in more detail and think through kind of how they might be applicable to the compensation program? I don't want to ask a bunch of questions if this is not the moment. It doesn't seem like it is.
Yeah, I think this probably isn't the moment because I think we can go deep on that. I wonder whether it makes sense to actually, following up on this meeting, to gather some of those questions and to help sort of direct what that conversation could look like, so we can bring as much information to the table as possible and go from there. But I don't know if you have other thoughts, Sarah, about what would make most sense in terms of leveraging that information.
I think we're thinking on a very similar path, Abby, that it would be helpful for us to know the questions people have. I think the other thing we could potentially do, if it's useful to the group, is set up some offline opportunities for members of the task force who have questions about any of these specific programs to meet with, as a group, with the programmatic experts who run those programs to dive into some of those details in a way that I won't be able to speak in depth in the same way as some of the folks on our team might be able to about some of the kinds of questions people might have. That's
super helpful. I'm sort of seeing y'all signed up for lots of work here, but I'm sort of seeing maybe a second committee type conversation between now and this task force. So one, we talked about the definition piece and some of the questions that we need to answer there. I wonder whether there's an information gathering conversation around some of these existing mechanisms. Again, not that we're limited to them, but just so that we have a good enough understanding that we can actually use that information to inform us. So I won't appoint you, Rakaya, to that committee, but we'll certainly invite you. So we are now going to switch gears again. We've got about 25 minutes remaining. So what I would like to do is spend a few minutes asking Sarah to just orient us to what is in the salary study or the salary scale paper that Aussie just released on Friday. Again, you all have it, but I thought it'd be helpful to just give us a little orientation of, you know, what's in there and how we can sort of think about it. Again, same kinds of questions that we've been talking about all along the way in terms of, you know, what this means for what we may want to prioritize, for what resources are going to be useful for us to draw from, given that one of our specific deliverables for this task force is a salary scale. This is a version that gives us a good, you know, starting point in terms of at least raising a whole bunch of questions about what, you know, what we need to be thinking about. And then if people have questions about it, again, we can maybe take a couple minutes for just kind of factual questions, but we'll probably follow up again on that one to get the deeper questions that people have, because we're definitely going to need to spend some time digging into that. So with that, let me turn it back to you, Sarah.
Thanks, Abby. So we produced a compensation pay parity schedule report. This is something that was required by the Birth to 3 Act of 2018. And the requirements that the Birth to 3 Act lays out are pretty specific. So I want to be clear that none of the compensation schedules that are laid out in that report are binding in any way on anyone, because they have not yet been funded. They are purely analytic in nature. And they don't necessarily constitute a recommendation that Aussie is making for how anything should be done. There are some very specific things that the Birth to 3 Act required us to do. The report does them. It doesn't necessarily reflect our perspective on the best way to address compensation. So I want to be very clear about that. So what did the Birth to 3 Act require us to do? First, it required us to develop sample pay scales for early childhood educators, and it specifically defined teachers and assistant teachers of infants and toddlers in centers as the groups of people that are defined in the legislation that reflect parity with DCPS after taking into account the staff roles, experience, and education credentials. And I'll talk a little bit more in a minute about how we did that. Second, it required us to estimate, using our cost estimation model, what the cost to child development facilities to deliver care while paying those salaries would be. So we calculated those costs. What would it actually cost per child, per infant or toddler to deliver care while paying staff at these levels? And then third, it required us to estimate what the cost to the district's child care subsidy program would be if the district paid subsidy providers at reimbursement rates that match that estimated cost. And so I want to be really clear that the cost estimate coming out of this is solely an estimate tied to paying for subsidy eligible children who are a minority of children enrolled in childcare in the district, and it does not cover the non-subsidy providers or the full cost for all infants and toddlers in the district to increase salary to parity. So going back to the salary schedules for a second, how did we do this? The Birth to 3 Act said parity with DCPS. So the DCPS salary schedule is one starting point for that work. And then the other starting point, which is the minimum bound for salaries, is the district's minimum wage, which is now a living wage set at $15.20 an hour. So no salaries could be higher than the DCPS salary schedule or could be lower than the living/minimum wage in our analysis. We used the DCPS salary schedule 12-month equivalent, because there are some DCPS schools that are on a 12-month schedule, as the base point for parity for teachers who have a bachelor's degree. Because a bachelor's degree is not required for all teachers in child development facilities, we then, using those two endpoints, drafted a separate salary schedule for associate's degree holders and CDA holders. The associate's degree salary schedule is set at the midpoint between the bachelor's degree salary schedule and the living wage. And the CDA salary schedule is set at 125% of the assistant teacher salary schedule for the base point. Across the teacher salary schedule, all of the increments for additional years experience are set at the same percentage increase as they are in the DCPS salary schedule. So if going from a step 7 to a step 8 increases your salary by 5% in the DCPS salary schedule, it does in this salary schedule as well. For assistant teachers, we just took the teacher's aide salary schedule used by DCPS because those roles and the responsibilities associated with them are similar, and because the credential is quite similar. There are slightly different credentials required by DCPS, but in terms of the range of options, they are fairly similar to the CDA, which is the licensing requirement for assistant teachers. So that's how the salary schedules were worked out. I'm sure people have lots of questions about that, but that's the starting point. I think I'm not going to talk through all of the costs that we reach for what it would cost providers to deliver care. What we did is basically we took our cost estimation model that we just used earlier this summer to publish modeling the cost of care that looks at all the set of costs and informs our subsidy reimbursement rate. We took that exact same model and tool, plugged salaries at the midpoint in the salary schedule into it for the required qualifications at each staff role. And then we set the benefits percentage that's included in the cost model to equal the percentage of salaries that benefits are in DCPS's budget, which I think is 16%. I can get the exact number and it's in the report. So that is where those numbers came in. So the pay schedules do not reflect benefits, but the cost estimate does reflect assumptions about benefits that may or that have a basis by basing them based on the percentage cost for benefits of DCPS, but that may not be the best way to estimate the cost for benefits in the child development sector. And then third, we then took all of those costs per child that were generated in that second step I talked about and took a historical, like a typical month pre-COVID monthly file of the children participating in the district subsidy system and put in the rates that each of those annual costs would translate into in place of the current rates and calculated what the monthly subsidy payment would be and then the annual subsidy payment if we had those rates and looked at the difference between the most recent year's subsidy spending. I realize I just made that sound a lot more complicated than it is, but we used actual subsidy data on the number of children served in a historic context pre-COVID when our enrollment was more steady to look at what the costs to implement would be. What questions do people have for me?
I don't have a question, Sarah, but I have a comment. In terms of benefits, because DCPS is so much larger than any child care facility, healthcare costs are going to be less per person. So I think looking at DCPS for benefits, the percent is probably an underestimate of what it would cost to provide comparable benefits for child care providers.
I think that's a very valid point, Dr. Dean. I would underscore that DCPS also has very high pension costs, which are reflected in that percentage as well. Yeah. Marika?
I think Taryn was before me.
Okay, Taryn.
Thanks, Marika. I was wondering if it might be possible to share the 12-month salary schedule. I have seen the DCPS traditional schedule, but I think if you annualize those payments, adding a fifth, then it ends up being more, I think, than the 12-month, but I'm not sure about that because I don't know.
Yeah, the DCPS 12-month schedule is in the appendix to the report that we share. It's also available where all the teacher salary schedules are posted on the DCPS website on their employee relations part of their website.
Oh, great. Sorry, I didn't see that.
No.
My other question is just to clarify this in the subsidy discussion, the rates, do they, the increased rates assume that all children are subsidized, or is it getting teachers to that? So it's assuming that 52% or 49%, I forget, of children in a facility are subsidized, and that would get to.
No, this is just based on the per child cost. So it's only for the subsidy children. That, yes, you understand the issue. And this has been our concern with the subsidy-based approach to try to increase compensation, because subsidy is tied to individual children. It, as the paper by Danielle Ewan and Gina Adams stated, there are some real issues with trying to use subsidy in that context for exactly the reasons you made. So that $58.3 million estimate is just the cost for increasing the payments for children who participate in subsidy to match the estimated per child cost that the model generated to deliver care while paying the parity scale salaries.
Got it. Thank you.
It doesn't include any effort to make up any kind of difference for children who are not participating in subsidy. Yeah.
Sarah,
we recognize that that's not the way the businesses actually work, but that is exactly what the Birth to 3 Act required us to estimate. So, yeah.
Sarah, I have a couple of more comments. I think DC charter schools estimate their benefits at a much higher rate. So I think we need to think about the fact that even though DCPS has pension responsibility, somehow DC public charter schools are saying their benefits are in the high 20s, their percent of salary. The other piece I want to talk about, and this is going to go to historic disparities, because most of the workforce in childcare have had lower wages. In most cases, they're going to have higher levels of health incidents, which will also raise the health insurance costs. So those are some of the disparities when you have this type of gap in income over time and access to benefits or not access to benefits. So many of the workers will not have previously had health care. And so you can expect that there is going to be a high healthcare expense for providers.
I'm going to cap this part of the discussion just looking at time, but I want to make sure we don't lose the conversation and the questions in the next steps here. So one, I just want to acknowledge the exchange that Taryn and Sarah were just having really echoes the concerns that many of you all raised at our first meeting around the notion of tying this fund directly to subsidy in any way, because of the way, and we saw it in terms of the data around centers, also seeing it in terms of the way this was cost modeled. That's sort of kind of an imaginary cost model. It's not it doesn't, in real life, that wouldn't mean that those centers then had enough money to pay all of those teachers the wage, right? Because unless they happen to have all subsidy kids. So I just want to acknowledge that that has come up from this group before. This information sort of underscores that, and thinking about the ways in which mechanisms, play out in real life is just going to be really important for us to think about. Again, I know that we're going to want to dig into the details of what that salary scale actually looks like. So Sarah gave us the overview of how we got there, but obviously there are lots of questions that that what's in there in terms of the scale itself raises, some of which speak to some of the questions you all talked about when we were talking about the definition, including around how you think about the credential piece, and the various roles, like how we define roles. Because again, if you have a salary scale, like you have to know what slot any individual is going into. There needs to be a clear way to define that. So when we talk about the definition of who's eligible, it runs right up against what a salary scale would look like in terms of categories. So
Abby, can I say two additional
please.
About the compensation study? Because I know we just shared it with people, and so folks haven't had a chance to dig in. I want to be clear, we put these schedules together based on our interpretation of what the Birth to 3 Act required us to do. I don't want to have it be interpreted as we are saying we think this is the best or the right salary schedule. I think it is helpful as a tool for actually looking at what some options are to try to help the task force think about, do these look like what we think a salary schedule that would make sense are, and what, might we think should be different about them, given various considerations. I also want to direct people to the conclusion of the report, where we laid out a series of questions that, as the folks who are most likely going to need to implement this, we hope the task force will engage and address. I think Abby has already teed up many of them, but that may be particularly helpful for folks to look at as you dig into the report.
Thanks, Sarah. So again, I think, some of you may have dug right in Friday when it hit your inbox, but hopefully some of you actually enjoyed your weekend and did not read the report, but it's going to be useful for all of us to get familiar with what's in there. And as you do read it, and particularly looking at some of those questions that Sarah alluded to in the conclusion, but also what, the way that they sort of lay out the factors that were considered, et cetera. As you do look through it, if you have questions around what's in there, or you see certain implications that we need to consider based on what's in there, please don't lose those. So write those down. We can, in the follow-up from this meeting, we'll identify a few things that we're looking for particular feedback on. And again, whether there's some mechanisms for us to get together in smaller groups. And Christina said, we'll need to make sure we're following whatever open meetings requirements there are on that. But I think it's going to be important for us to do a little bit of dividing and conquering on getting some more information on some of these things. So we'll lay that out in the follow-up. But please know that this is not the end of that conversation. And hello to Rakaya's cat. We have 7 minutes left, and we started early, and so I definitely don't want to end late. But I want to just literally show you all, and we're not going to have time to go through this, but I want to, this again is in the deck that you all have in your inbox. This is that draft table of contents that I referred to. And so what you have here, and I know this is just a lot of words on a small slide, but you have the buckets based on a combination of what is specifically laid out in the task force charge in terms of the legislative language, and based on the conversations leading up to today. So this does not reflect, obviously, what we talked about today. It tries to identify, here are the things that we think we will need to address in some way, shape, or form in this report. With the understanding that this is not going to be, we're not going to answer all challenges related to early childhood in the district in this one report. We have a specific charge, but there obviously are intersections that that we may need to talk about, because even if they're not totally squarely in the center of what we're doing, but if we know their implications, that at least need to be named. So one of the things that I'm going to ask you all to do is to look at what's in here and provide some initial feedback on, are these the right things? Did we in fact, one, deliver on what the core piece of the charge is that we've been asked to do specifically? And does this reflect what you think are the most important issues that we're going to need to address without regard to specific content? Is there something that's missing? Is there anything that you would actually say is out of scope for the task force? Because again, we don't want mission creep here, because we have limited time. So if there's things in here that you think actually aren't really relevant, that's also something good to point out. I'll highlight a couple of the things that are in here. One, we've talked a number of times around potential disparate impact on key groups. Some of this is specifically called out in the legislative language, but we've added some others based on our conversations of how this, whatever it is that we propose, how it impacts different groups. And then the other thing I'll note is Roman numeral 10 here around mitigating risks and protecting against unintended consequences. So again, these are all the ones that came up at our first meeting. There may be others. I know there are others that we talked about, the PKEEP as one that we want to keep an eye on, and there's some others that certainly have come up tonight. So, want to just flag this for folks. Again, people who are watching this on Zoom or on YouTube, all of these materials are available in a shared folder, and Christina, we can figure out how to get a link. I don't know if we can put that on the chairman's, I don't know. We will figure out a way to publicize the link. Certainly everybody on the task force has it, and you can share it far and wide so people can see all these materials. And we completely ran out of time for the key themes from stakeholder input, but hopefully this conversation tonight will generate lots more opportunities for interesting stakeholder input, because we got a lot of meaty stuff out. So we will figure out how to create some time in our future meetings. Those of you who have collected input and have any written versions of that, please share those with Christina and me, and we will make sure that's distributed to everyone as well. So that's another way that we can, get that out there. In addition to the expertise that is in this group, we again will continue to gather expertise from both the various stakeholder groups who are engaging in this, but also some external experts. Christina Setlow and I have been having some of these conversations with some of the people who you all have identified in your entry survey and input. So we will continue to do that, and we will share back. But we will also identify whether some of these folks would be particularly useful resources to bring to task force meetings, so that all of you can ask questions and engage as we figure out what our thorniest issues are. And then the last thing I'll share again, so we've got our future meetings scheduled. We'll figure out if there's some smaller group committee meetings that happen in the interim on some of the issues we identified tonight. Please encourage folks to use that email, ececompensation@gmail. A couple of folks already have, so thank you to people who've asked questions or provided information, and we'll get those links out. Apologies that I think my agenda bit off a little bit more than we could chew. That is what it is, but we will continue chasing all this stuff down. And all task force members, if you have questions, thoughts, concerns that come up, please share them so that we can make sure we're quickly addressing them given our timeline. Anything I'm forgetting, Christina Setlow? All right. Thank you so much for your engagement at the end of a long day. And with 1 minute to go, I will adjourn us officially. Or 0 minutes to go. My clock just turned 8. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thanks, Abby and
Thank
Christina.
you.
Thank you very much.